All right, testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, everybody, I wanted to continue with my main lecture series on the analysis by Al-Lajlaj and Asuli of the Double Mujannah. I put a Double Mujannah up here on the board. This is a position, well, this is from my game against One Lek, but I'm just going to use the position here as just a starting place for the analysis. So, in the last lecture, I know afterwards, a lot of people were asking me about what happens when black chooses to put the rook on c7 rather than swinging it all the way over to b7. So, I want to try to cover that today. I also want to try to cover more of the analysis from Al-Lajlaj of what happens when white plays a3 and b4, black takes, black makes his own b5 break, and white pushes c5. So there's a fair amount of material to get through, and I've organized it as best I can. So hopefully at least what I present will be easier to follow than if you were to try on your own to go through the tables in Murray. And then for my next lecture after this, I want to talk about some other alternative approaches for white, particularly trying to push in the center with e4. So we'll see what we can get done today. So in this position, starting position for the Double Mujannah, Al-Lajlaj gives a3 as the main move, and here black plays rook to g7. We'll come back hopefully towards the end of the lecture to see what happens if black plays a6 here instead, following a copycat strategy. But folks have been asking about the rook swing to c7, so I want to try to tackle that first. Certainly, this appears to be a very challenging approach, and if either side isn't careful, you can get in a lot of trouble. So white would play rook to g2, black plays rook to c7 here, and white simply copies with rook to c2. Notice, of course, when black is playing the rook to b7, then it makes sense in a lot of cases for white to put his rook on b2. But if white were to swing the rook over to b2 now, there's going to end up being a big problem. So if play continues along these lines and black plays here, now all of a sudden at the end of all of the tactics, the white knight could end up hanging. So, and also to the extent that white wants to try to get the c5 break in, black has a rook already lined up on it, and this is the idea behind placing the rook on c7, really is getting ready for this set of breaks on the Shah side. So looking at all that, that's why white is going to put his rook on c2 as well. Everybody's matched up, and white is hoping to make something of this extra tempo. So black plays a6, white plays b4. In my past lectures, I've discussed the idea that black might actually just want to try to hold this structure and play some other move here. So, for instance, I think a move like just sticking the Furzan out is perfectly playable. And as we saw with some of my experiences playing Rayquaza, probably white is going to be thinking about opening another front, whether it's with d4, whether it's with e4, or even h3, g4 type of ideas, although that, that's going to involve a lot of preparation. But of course, if we're in the 800s, if we're in the 900s, black's going to exchange and play b5. So over 1,000 years ago, this was where all of the action was. There was the exchange by black, and now pawn to b5. So Al-Lajlaj gives pawn to c5 as being White's main moves. White's main move here. My overall assessment is that the placement of the rook on c7 is going to end up being stronger for Black here than was the placement of the rook on b7 in the very first lecture. So as we get into some concrete lines, you'll see why. But the play along the c-file, when the c-file actually opens up, ends up being pretty meaningful in a lot of lines, and also in lines where Black exchanges on c5, the rook is hitting this potentially weak pawn. So the play is going to get very sharp. We're going to look at a few different moves for Black. Notably, we're not going to look at d5 in any kind of depth. As I explained in the first lecture, this is going to be some strategic mistake, weakening the e5 square. White has a fairly simple plan of bringing his first hand into the game. So just pushing past with d5 really isn't going to be an option for Black here, or a serious one. So what are the moves? Well, d takes c5 I think is going to be the critical line. This is the main, what I think would be the main line. And then pawn to e5 is another move that we want to take seriously. You'll remember that when the rook was on b7 and the white rook was on b2, Al-Lajlaj thought e5 might be the main move and might be the main try for Black. I think, as we'll see, one of the reasons that it's not as strong here in this situation is that White is always going to be able to insert the move c takes d5 or c takes d6, and it's going to be with tempo on Black's rook. So that is going to be annoying in a lot of the tactical sequences. Another tactic that comes up is that with the weakness of the d5 square and the rook being on d7, in some lines White might be able to throw the knight into the d5 square if Black moves this knight away. Like, let's say Black put his knight on d7 to try to attack the c5 pawn. Well, now when White plays knight to d5, that's going to end up hitting this rook. So e5 is going to be a move that we're going to look at, but we need to be aware it doesn't go very well with a rook placement on c7. If Black's going to play the line with e5, he's probably better off with a rook on b7. So e5 is a move. And another move that we're going to consider is just, what if Black continues to play solidly, brings the first hand to d7. Really, this is just going to be a chance for me to show what White's overall strategy is with removing these pawns and then trying to activate the first hand, trying to play on the dark squares. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to look extensively at the main move, which is d takes c5. So I'll go a little bit out of order. Since we're going to end up spending so much time on d takes c5, I'll go ahead and look at the move pawn to e5 now. So, according to Al-Lajlaj, if Black plays pawn to e5, White starts by playing c takes d6, hits the rook, as I mentioned. You'll notice if the rook were on b7, Black could respond with e takes f4. Just throw e takes f4 in. White plays g takes f4, and then boom, Black's able to grab the pawn on d6, and without too much carnage on Black's part. But now, of course, obviously, if Black plays e takes f4, this is just hanging a rook. So Black has to react to it. Bishop takes d6 is the move Al-Lajlaj gives. White now plays f takes e5. So already there's some problems for Black. He's just lost a pawn, and there's now the rather uncomfortable fork. in most modern chess books, the analysis really would just stop here. Probably, the players would get to this point. And if you're analyzing, you say, okay, obviously black can't play this way. But Al-Lajlaj actually continues the analysis. He has, I guess, a cute tactical trick that he wants to show us. Black plays knight to d7. Obviously there's no problem here with just grabbing the elephant. But a bit surprisingly, perhaps, Al-Lajlaj is continuing the analysis here, wants to prove the very decisive advantage for white. Okay, now there's this move knight to d5 that we talked about. Okay, the rook on c7 is definitely misplaced here. If the rook moves away, then white is going to grab the knight on c6, and that is going to be very clearly winning. So Al-Lajlaj gives knight takes b4 as sort of a desperado attack. I suppose the idea is something along the lines of white plays rook takes c7, black plays knight takes d5, black is attacking this, black's down the exchange, but maybe it can still continue to play on. But Al-Lajlaj continues with knight takes c7, sort of a clever move. Black, of course, has to grab this rook. Just taking the knight's impossible because it's guarded by the rook. So, okay, knight takes c2 is forced. And here Al-Lajlaj says, now white captures. Capturing the elephant, defending the knight on c7. Black's knight, amazingly, is trapped. If you look, the rook covers the b4 square. The a3 square is covered by the elephant. e3, again, covered by the elephant. So knight takes e1 is the move that Al-Lajlaj gives. And Al-Lajlaj now just says, okay, knight takes e1 and white wins. So white here is just up an incredible amount of material. So it's interesting to me just to note the fact that Al-Lajlaj gives so much analysis suggests that this was a line that might have actually occurred in a game. If we put on our historian's cap, why when Al-Lajlaj's notes are so sparse on many other ideas, why would he include this much analysis on e5? Well, I think the logical conclusion is that this probably actually came up in a game. And it's easy to see why, because e5 is a main move when the rooks are on b7 and b2 respectively. So it sounds like somebody either didn't understand or forgot his preparation throughout the move e5, and then lost in this sort of spectacular fashion in this line. So I think we can likely conclude that there was some game of some sort that might have happened there. A lot of the lines that Al-Lajlaj gives ostensibly were games that were played. At one point early in the text, he refers to the sample lines as games. Or sample games, but he doesn't tell us who played them in nearly all of the cases. We don't know who the actual players were, and the finishes or endings of the games typically aren't given. He only carries the analysis so far, but it's sort of a tantalizing historical aspect of all this to think e5 was probably a blunder that actually came up for it to have gotten this much attention. So, okay, moving the first hand to d7, what happens here? Knight to e2 is the move that's given by Al-Lajlaj. First hand to d2 also makes sense to me. I don't think that it's actually that much different. I think the idea with all of this, my suggestion here is actually Ferdinand to d2, and let's say that black plays knight to d5. Then oh, let's see. Well, all right. I think I'm actually yeah. I might be missing something in my notes here. Um, okay. All right. So sorry about that. I was just thinking about my notes. Okay. So what happens here? The line that Al-Lajlaj gives is knight to e2, and uh, I think it's possible here black would actually respond with knight to d5. The move knight to d5 isn't given by Al-Lajlaj. He actually gives rook on c7 to b7, which is a move that's actually it's a bit hard to understand. Um, after knight to e2, I think knight to d5, putting pressure immediately on b4 is the correct way for black to play. Um, the move knight takes b4, it's not possible to stop it. So white needs to come up with a way to generate some play fairly quickly to get compensation. So the move e4 is my suggestion here. Black would play knight takes b4. And then my idea is to play c takes d6 to hit the rook. Black obviously can't take on c2 because white will throw in d takes c7 with check, and then pick up the knight on c2. So black will then capture on d6, and now my idea for white is to play rook to c5. And I would assess this position as being unclear. White has a fair amount of compensation for the pawn. Black does have two connected passed pawns, but of course in Chantrage this is not as powerful because even if they were to make it all the way to the second rank and promote, they only become Furzans, so it's not so big a deal. And in the meantime, White has a fairly nice plan of playing Furzan to d2, then into c3, where it will hit the knight on b4, potentially trapping it. If the knight is forced to go into a2, then it's almost certainly going to be trapped by something like rook to b2. So you can imagine that the knight on b4 is going to be forced to go somewhere else. Black's going to have to come up, waste some tempi. Black can't move the knight away because white will exchange rooks and then play rook takes b4. So at some point, black may have to play the pawn to a5. Of course, then when white gets the Furzan into c3 and then the knight moves away, say to a6, white is going to be able to play rook takes b5. Because both rooks now are going to be hitting this weak b5 pawn. So you can imagine that there's going to be some carnage here on the Shah side where white is going to hopefully pick off some material, and then white's left with some positional advantage as the Furzan then works its way up potentially to e5, where it will start to menace the dark squares around black's king. So again, looking at this position, Al-Lajlaj gives knight to e2 and just assumes that black is going to play rook to b7, or rook c to b7. Doesn't look at the move knight to d5, which ostensibly wins a pawn. We don't really know why he doesn't look at it, but my suggestion for white in this position would be pawn to e4, knight takes b4, throw in the intermezzo to exchange off the c-pawns, and then plant the rook on c5. And it looks like something that will give white a fair amount of compensation, although, concrete analysis would say one way or the other. Maybe this needs to be tested in a few lines. But as for me, if I got this position on, and here we are at move 19, rather than playing knight to e2 and allowing knight to d5, I would actually maybe prepare the move. I think that bringing the first hand to d2 is a good idea, so that, let's say that black does play this move, rook c to b7, that Al-Lajlaj suggests, then I would play knight to e2, and if black plays knight to d5, here I don't have to sacrifice anything at all. I can just bring the first hand in comfortably to c3, defend the b4 pawn, and white is ready to kick out the black knight next move by bringing the pawn to e4. So it's possible that first hand to d2 is an improvement here over the line that Al-Lajlaj gives with knight to e2, but a bit hard to say because the position is getting to be a bit murky. So again, we're looking at all of this. We've discarded the move e5 for black on move 18 as being a tragedy. D takes c5 is going to be the main move, and we're still looking at this move bringing the first hand to d7, mostly because it's instructive. So okay, so Al-Lajlaj gives the line knight to e2. Black in Al-Lajlaj's main line plays rook on c to b7. Here, white goes ahead, starts on this first hand march. Black is worried about the possibility of this first hand coming into the d4 square. If white gets the first hand into d4, there's going to be some good options for where that first hand is going to go after white plays the c takes d6 exchange. So to prevent this march, and then also to get some counterplay, black now plays pawn to e5. White, of course, is going to continue with c takes d6. This is fairly thematic. When black plays the pawn to e5, white wants to play c takes d6, so that if bishop takes d6, white can play f takes e5 with this fork. So c takes d6, this is when black throws this in. Of course, the rook is no longer on c7. So this is really the idea behind playing rook on c to b7. Black is preparing to play e5, so that because if black were to play e5 right away, we would have the same problem as before. C takes d6, e takes f4, and the rook hangs. So that's the point of rook c to b7. I tend to think knight d5 is probably better, but this is the point. It feels like if black is going to play this way, then making the rook lift to c7 was probably a mistake. And if black wanted to play this way, black should have put the rook all the way over on b7 in the first place. That's, the plan was bringing the first hand to d7 doesn't feel right when black has opted for something so active as putting the rook on c7. So rook c to b7, white starts to bring the first hand in, e5 to try to stop the first hand from coming in. Now white plays c takes d6. Black can throw in e takes f4 because the rook isn't hanging. White just plays g takes. Black plays bishop takes d6. Okay, and now white plays queen to, or first hand to c3. And Al-Lajlaj gives this as, white having some advantage. The reason that white has an advantage here has to do with the difference between the c4 and c5 points and the e4 and the e5 points. White has two very good Fursan outposts, c5 and e5. Black, meanwhile, really has no good Fursan outpost because the white pawn on d3 protects everything. There are going to be some challenges for white, namely that the b4 pawn is attacked and so weak. In order to try to move forward with this game, white probably is going to play a move like knight to e5 or play a move like knight to d4, knight e4, knight e5, and we'll try to exchange off the knights to hopefully give him some freedom. You know, I don't think that the advantage for white is by any means simple here. Black might have some good resources. For instance, you know, if black plays knight to d5 here, it's very possible that we're going to end up seeing white actually just sacrificing this pawn on b4 in order to try to run his Fursan in or to get play in the center. You know, black's plan ganging up on the b4 pawn is fairly imposing. So, you know, if I were to get this position, I don't think it's that simple. Knight to d5 is going to at least give white some headaches. And white's going to have to think very seriously about how he's going to defend the pawn on b4. Maybe he just will play rook on c to b2 with the idea of playing knight to e5 or knight to d4 and exchanging some pieces, trying to get black's pieces away from the attack on the b4 square. But again, black has at least enough counterplay here that I don't think that he's clearly worse. But I would agree with Al-Lajlaj's assessment that white has a slightly better position. And certainly I would want to take the white pieces. So so taking all that into consideration, where are we? What's our assessment of the move Fursan to d7? Well, I think that it's awkward with the black rook being on c7 because white's always able to hit the d6 pawn with tempo. And if black is going to play this way, bringing the rook to c7, he should go ahead and go for the main line, which is d takes c5. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take on c5. We'll go into the main line now. White, of course, takes on c5. Al-Lajlaj gives knight to e7. The idea here is fairly simple. Black is trying to get some counterplay with a knight coming into d5, and he also wants to clear the way for this rook to attack the c5 pawn and really show the strength of black's maneuver, having put the rook on c7. White, of course, needs to defend the c5 pawn, so knight to e2 is our thematic move. Now the rook defends the pawn very well, and white is ready to start running his Fursan in. And white also has a good outpost on e5 and a good outpost on d4. So black can't sit for too long because otherwise white will start to consolidate. So black plays knight to d7, trying to hit the c5 pawn again. Of course, if white were to play the move pawn to d4 at any point, this now has blocked the inroad for his Fursan to come in. There's sort of an alternate route into black's position into b6, but doesn't look quite as enticing as getting a centralized Fursan. there's always a risk if you were to stick a Furzan on b6, white might not achieve anything with it. Black could simply move his pieces away from the Shah side, start moving them towards the center, and you don't really accomplish anything. And then, of course, the other problem with the move pawn to d4 is that Black is going to have good control over the center and will have an excellent outpost for his own Furzan on the e4 square. So when White can help it, he's not going to play pawn to d4, but he does have to defend the pawn on c5, so that's the reason that bishop to a3 is played. Black needs to keep the momentum, can't let White consolidate. Black plays pawn to b4, very aggressive, very dynamic. Black has to do something to disrupt the flow of White's game. So obviously, White doesn't want to lose a tempo, just bringing the elephant back. And the knight on d7 does protect the rook on b8, so there's no pin at the moment along the b file. So White plays rook on c to b2, ganging up on the b file, ganging up on this pawn, trying to continue to push an advantage on the Shah side. Okay. Many moves for Black now. And the analysis, this is where the analysis really takes off. This is a starting point, if you will. So we're going to look at several moves. Knight to c6 is going to be what we're going to consider the main line, so to speak. Point is just to hold the pawn on b4, and Black is continuing to develop on the Shah side. We're also going to look at another move that Al-Lajlaj gives, which is rook to a8. The idea is Black is stepping off of the b line. White is going to play rook takes b4, and then Black is going to play knight to d5, trying to create counterplay with a rook on b4, and by taking the e3 pawn, notice that White has stepped his elephant off of the defense of the e3 square. So that makes this very clever move, rook to a8, possible with the knight fork on d5. And then, let's see, we're at move 23. We're going to look at one other move that I think is very intuitive. We'll look at the pawn push a5. So 3 moves we're going to consider. We're going to consider the main line with knight to c6. We'll look at rook to a8, and then we're going to look at pawn to a5. So let's go ahead and look at the main line. I think when we've seen the idea for Black with knight to c6, we'll understand maybe why it's the strongest move, at least according to Al-Lajlaj. So with knight to c6, there's always a danger for White that Black is going to consolidate this pawn on b4. If the pawn's on b4, then this Furzan is never going to run to c3, and it's never going to get its dream home on e5. So White has to do something to remove the defender on c6. That is why knight to d4, knight on e to d4, is the strongest move according to Al-Lajlaj. The idea is, of course, just to remove this defender. So the line that Al-Lajlaj gives is knight takes d4. White plays knight takes d4 as well, and now Black plays pawn to a5, trying to hold on to the b4 pawn. White, of course, is enjoying the benefit now of this strong pin. Remember when the black knight was on c6, the b4 pawn wasn't pinned because black had 2 defenders on the b8 square. Now he only has 1. So black is not threatening b takes a3. This leaves white free to continue with Farzan to d2. So Farzan is coming up to c3, and white may actually get to the point where he's threatening to just play c-take, or Farzan takes b4, and win both of these pawns for the Farzan. So black has to do something. Again, white's always threatening something, and black is always threatening. Black always has to be threatening something because this is a very sharp Shatranj middle game. Black plays rook to a8 here, threatening b4 takes a3. Okay, so white, of course, isn't going to just back down and give up the c5 pawn. That looks like suicide. But at the same time, the threat of b takes a3 is very real. So white has to find a way to keep attacking. So knight to b5 is the move. Black plays rook to c6. And here, Al-Lajlaj basically thinks that white has nothing better than to take the draw by repetition. After knight to d4, rook to c7, knight to b5, the game is going to be drawn by threefold repetition. Al-Lajlaj notes that black could move the rook away, trying for a win. Rook on c to a6. He's not super optimistic, though, about black's chances to play for a win, because here white will actually play rook to c2. And the idea, of course, if black gets greedy and takes the bishop on a3, well, white's already defending this very key pawn. White could probably just play something like rook to b7 here, and it seems like white would have a big advantage. Let's say something like rook to a7, but then white is just going to exchange and make this fork on c6. Maybe the move rook to b8 here would be a better try. The lines are going to get very sharp here. Everything's going to be very concrete, but pawn to c6 certainly looks like a good idea. White's threatening to play pawn to c7 check with his fork. White's also threatening the knight, but the knight can't move because otherwise the black rook on b8 hangs. So black would probably be forced to exchange. White's going to play c takes b7. And now this elephant on c8, actually, if you look, it's trapped. And of course, if the elephant falls, then the e6 pawn is going to be very weak. So, this doesn't look like a very convincing way for black to try to play. Certainly seems to me black would be wise to have instead taken the draw by threefold repetition. So there really isn't any further analysis from Al-Lajlaj after the move rook c2. But one gets the feeling that he likes white's chances with the pawn coming down to c6, where it will be supported by the knight, potentially running all the way to c7. If black plays king to e7 at some point, this elephant is always going to be able to jump in, give check. So there's going to be a fair number of tactical possibilities. And in terms of practical chances, it seems like white is going to be doing very well. So that is why, more likely than not, the correct approach for both sides is, after we get to this position, the player should take the threefold repetition right here. Black doesn't want to step away from the C file where he hits the white pawn, but at the same time, white doesn't have anything better than to make the repetition with a knight trying to drive the rook away. So that is, according to Al-Lajlaj, the best, the result with play for that's best on both sides in the rook to c7 line. All right, so we'll back up and we'll consider some ideas that Al-Lajlaj explores, the alternatives on move 23. What are the alternatives to knight to c6, which is the main line? Well, we mentioned pawn to a5 as being one. Pawn to a5 is one, and then rook to b8 is another. So let's take a look at, or rook b8 to a8. So let's take a look at rook on b8 to a8 first. So if you remember, the idea is white will play rook takes b4 and black plays knight d5 with this fork. So Al-Lajlaj suggests here rook on b4 to b2 as being white's best option. Black will now take on e3, and white will now play the slightly counterintuitive move king to c1. Of course, what you don't want to do is play king to d2 and then end up losing this elephant on f1 with check. So king to c1 is the suggested move. Now, black has to play precisely here. I think the idea is something along the lines of, if black is going to take the knight or take the elephant with his knight on f1 after this Fursian comes up to d2, the knight is trapped, and we're going to see from white then the process of playing king to c2 and then picking off this knight on f1. It's possible that concrete analysis would show Fursian to f2 being better, but in any case, I think the idea is just that this knight is going to be trapped. So I think black does have to be precise here, because if nothing else, next move, white is going to play Fursian to d2. When black retreats the knight to d5, then white is going to begin the process of running this Fursian in to d4, and white is going to have a much better game there with control over the d4 and e5 squares. And meanwhile, black's rook on a8 is really sidelined. So, in fact, when you think about this position, you can think about rook to a8 as very clever, but one of the big problems for black is in the middle games that are going to arise from this, the rook on a8 is going to be sidelined, particularly since this elephant is on c8 and can't easily develop. The rook on a8 is going to be a huge liability. Now, Al-Lajlaj, in order to save black's position here, suggests the brilliant little tactic knight takes c5, and says that after elephant takes, rook takes, king to d2, which is forced, black here should be very happy to cash in on this repetition and to take a draw. So, Al-Lajlaj's assessment of the line rook to a8 is, even though it's not the main move, knight to c6 is the main move, but his assessment of the move rook to a8 is that black likely has a draw here. This, though, is where I would want to play some of my new ideas for white. I don't think that it's this simple. I think that white actually has a try for the advantage here by playing rook, not the passive rook to b2, but rather bringing the rook all the way into b7. This does involve some material sacrifice, but I don't think that it's really anything to be worried about, and I'll show you what I mean. So black will play knight takes e3. White again doesn't want to play king d2, which would give up the elephant with check, so white plays king to c1. If black were to just grab the material, I think this is going to be a huge problem for him after just bringing the first hand to f2 or even d2, and then white's going to play king to c2, and this knight is going to be trapped. Black's forces are all the way back here, so it doesn't look like there's going to be a good way for black to come in and try to save this wayward knight, particularly if white engages in a rook exchange at some point, really leaving black with no active pieces. Again, this rook on a8 is very, very sidelined. So knight takes f1 is not going to be possible, but in the meantime, white seems to have very good pressure along the 7th rank. So black is going to look for a way to try to exchange off some of that pressure. So if black exchanges rooks and then plays rook to b8, my thought here is, okay, well, maybe what white needs to do is just play rook to a7, keep this pressure along the line, with the idea that, okay, black probably is now going to take on f1, but white will just play the first hand up, keep the knight at bay. There's maybe not a clear plan to trap the knight yet. Maybe there is, because maybe white can play first hand to d2, play king d1. When black plays rook to b1 check, maybe dodge back with the elephant and try to surround the knight this way. So there may be concrete tactics to win the knight, but even if white doesn't win the knight, which I think, maybe he won't win the knight, I like this position for white because white is only down an elephant, but black's pieces are still very passive at home. The king is doing an okay job for now, guarding some of the weak squares along the b file, and white is going to have opportunities to play pawn to c6. There's some weakness on h7, so probably black will bring the knight in to f6. But white may have the opportunity to fork. So, for instance, in this position, the move pawn to c6, threatening this knight, is a really big problem for black because white is going to play pawn to c7 and fork the king and the rook. So, well, in fact, that looks so strong that knight takes f1 probably isn't possible right away. Black really has his work cut out for him to try to figure out what the appropriate defense is going to be. Maybe it's a good offense with rook to b3. You know, white probably isn't bent out of shape about the possibility of even losing this elephant. The ideas with pawn to c6 or knight, and then the knight coming into e5, knight coming into d4, maybe even the bishop coming into c5 at some point. There's so many possibilities to try to get a mating net that I think this is going to be very, very hard for black to deal with. So I would be very happy to get that position in one of my games, even though I may give up some material. So exchanging rooks and playing rook to b8, I don't think works as a good idea for black. Bringing the rook on a to a7 is maybe a better way to try to go about it. My idea here is to exchange rooks, and then takes. Oh, I seem to have failed to insert a move here. So okay, so rook to b7, knight takes e3, king to c1. All right, and now rook on a to a7. My idea here: exchange rooks, play Fursan to d2. If black grabs this bishop, then just king to c2 is going to be winning the knight. Black will have to retreat with knight to d5. Okay, and now just bring the Fursan to c3. I like this position pretty well for white. The Fursan's coming into d4, the knight's coming into e5. Black certainly isn't lost here by any stretch of the imagination. Black is going to have ideas of his own, bringing his own Fursan in, but the pawn on d3 does a nice job really muting the outposts for black. So I think this position, if you just look at the activity of the rooks as well, seems like white is doing very well for himself. So that is my suggested improvement in this line on Al-Lajlaj's rook on 4 to b2, which, as we saw, just leads to a draw after the exchange and this sacrifice by black. I think that instead, being a little more ambitious and putting the rook all the way on b7, rather than boxing in white's king, which can't flee to b2 if you put the rook there, this is going to provide white some real winning chances. Obviously here, knight takes c5 isn't going to work at all. White just exchange rooks and grab the knight. So that's my idea. After rook on c to b2, I think now we're starting to see why knight to c6 is considered the main move. Rook to a8, sidelining the rook, was probably too passive. I think Al-Lajlaj sensed this, and I think with my idea of bringing the rook into b7, I think white can really exploit that. So we've looked now at knight to c6. We've looked at rook to a8. The only move remaining that we want to look at today is pawn to a5. Okay, so pawn to a5. I'll give you Al-Lajlaj's line. As we know, the b5 square is a little bit weakened by the move pawn to a5, and white is going to be continuing with this plan anyway. Knight on e2 to d4. Black has to do something to stop this pressure along the B line, because otherwise this Furzan is going to come into C3 and threaten to take on B4, and black isn't going to have any good response. And of course, you know, if black plays knight to C6, white's going to exchange off that knight, bring his own knight into D4, and the white knight is going to be a lot more active than its counterpart on D7. So if we just look at that, you know, this, if we compare the knight positions, and we just notice that white still has this really good pin along the B file and can march his Furzan into C3, threatening to take on B4. This is going to be a really bad position for black. He's always having to worry about, well, if you bring a rook to B7, there's a C6 fork. You bring a rook to A7, knight to C6 is going to hit all three of these guys. So lots and lots of problems for black there. If he tries now at this late stage to play knight to C6, it's too late to do it here. So in order to keep the threats going, in order to get the rook off the B file, Al-Lajlaj can find nothing better than rook to A8. I also don't think there's anything better. Now white comes in with knight to B5, though, which is thematic, as we've seen. There are some slight subtleties here when thinking about the position in the main line versus the position now. Now, after rook to C6, there's no need for white to take a repetition. White can instead bring his other knight in. And now all of a sudden white really has penetrated the Shah side. This is now looking like a nightmare for black. Because rook to C6 is not going to lead to that repetition line, and white is ready to bring his other knight in, we see Al-Lajlaj suggest rook to B7. The idea is just to attack this knight. Might be possible here to consider a move like knight to D4, but the problem is this pin on the B file, you know, now it's black bearing down on the B file. White's pin is no longer. Black would just be able to grab this elephant, and then the C5 pawn is in some trouble. I mean, then again, maybe not. Right? There could be some crazy. There could be something crazy with pawn to C6. You know, black's going to grab a rook, white's going to grab material. You know, black is going to play something like this. Maybe white grabs more material. The players are going to exchange something. Maybe white plays rook to B2. You know, and where are we here? Well, okay, this looks like a little bit of a positional advantage for white, with the pawns in some potential trouble, and the white Furzan looking like a better Furzan compared to black's. So, yeah, just looking at the material, maybe this is possible. Maybe there's some idea here with knight on F to D4. Looks risky. You know, if you find a way for black to bust the move knight on F to D4, leave it in the comments section below. I'd be curious. You know, I'll show you the line again. This is just something that I've kind of been musing about. Possible here that the correct move is for black to move the rook away. But then I also think, like, well, white's only down an elephant. It's no big deal, right? I mean, you know, rook to B6, that's mate. So, you know, okay, black is going to take this this rook. White takes here. There's the fork. Black has to save his rook. White's going to grab this. attacks the knight. King takes, probably king takes this right because, well, you know, I mean, this is mate again. So knight takes, this is mate. So it's got to be king takes, and now white probably plays rook takes b2. So that's a line. This is not given by Al-Lajlaj. This is just something that I've been toying with as a possibility, not on f to d4. The move that Al-Lajlaj gives, though, is certainly simpler. Even if it's not as tempting. This is such a tempting move to play if white can get away with it. Al-Lajlaj prefers instead knight to c3, which it keeps white's positional advantage intact, but it looks passive. So he gives knight to c3. Black plays rook on b7 to b8. So this is very awkward. But again, white has these two pieces potentially hanging. If not for this pin, black has to find a way out of the pin. Moving the rook back does the trick. And black is hoping that having two rooks behind two passed pawns is going to mean something. Doesn't mean quite as much as it would in modern chess, although nothing to be sneezed at either. So rook to b8. Now white plays knight to a4. This is a move that Al-Lajlaj has planned. This is just white goes ahead and sacrifices this elephant. The pawn on c5 is a huge strategic advantage for white. It's so good for this Ferzan. The price to be paid is this elephant, so elephants are not worth much. White gives it up. Okay, now we head into the end game. After rook, this is very interesting. Al-Lajlaj gives knight takes b8 as the main line, and his idea is actually if black plays rook takes b8, then white's going to step away and win this pawn with rook to a1. So I'll just show you how the sample line might play out. Black might play pawn to a2. Not a great move, but okay. Just forcing white to take the pawn so as to get a little bit of counterplay. Black plays knight to d5. Again, by putting the pawn on a2, black is hoping to cause white a little bit of tactical inconvenience. The knight to d5 threatens the pawn on e3. Ferzan to d2 is thematic. Now, okay, black steps in with rook to b1. The idea for black is that now that we've removed this Ferzan from the first rank, we've made it impossible for white to play king to c2 because this elephant falls. So white's king is forced into a slightly more passive position on e2. Okay, black continues to bring pieces over to the Shah side, knight to b4, attacking this rook to a3, knight to c2. Again, just trying to give problems for white, but rook to c3, okay, knight to b4, pawn to c6, knight to f6, and then, okay, finally, rook to c5, so threatening the a5 pawn. This is just a sample line that I came up with. This is nothing of Al-Lajlaj's. But I wanted to carry this to its logical conclusion, basically, so that you can see the tactics don't really peter out to anything for black, and there's a big difference in the strength of the pawns. This pawn on a5 is fixed; it's weak. This is a great outpost. This is a great square for white. For the Ferzan's coming in. So, and black's minor pieces are also inactive. So this would be a clear advantage for white. So again, just sort of a sample line. rook takes b8. If rook takes b8, white will avoid this exchange and actually just activate his rook, and the pressure on a5 is going to ultimately be huge. And black isn't going to be able to achieve anything along the b file. So Al-Lajlaj gives instead knight takes b8, gives this move, you know, an endorsement as being black's best try. And then hereafter, just rook to a1 as well. Al-Lajlaj concludes that white is somewhat better. And I agree with that assessment. The pawn on a3 falls. After the pawn on a3 falls, the pawn on a5 is a big target. And these dark squares around black's king are going to be a huge problem. So ultimately, after rook to a8, knight to b5, rook to b7, Al-Lajlaj's solution of knight to c3, followed by knight to a4, appears to be a very elegant solution, and a good way for white to get a slight positional advantage here. Again, knight on f to d4 looks tempting. If anybody has any ideas on that, leave them in the comments. But ultimately, I think we can see from these lines why pawn to a5 is not a great move. The problem with playing the pawn to a5 is that it's just too slow and allows white to get his knight into the d4 square first. Black really does need to play knight to c6 so that when white plays the knight in, black is in a position to exchange and play a5 and hopefully create this scenario where black is going to be able to force a repetition as in the main line. So knight to c6, good move, solid move, should lead to a draw. A5, probably a weak move. Probably will end up leading to big advantage for white. And then rook to a8 with the idea of takes, and taking on e3. Very interesting try. Al-Lajlaj thought it was a draw. I think rook to b7 is going to end up giving white some chances. So that, my friends, is the main line of the Mujannah, the double Mujannah with black playing the rook to c7. Overall, I've liked the lines that black has played today. I think these are stronger than putting the rook on b7. But I think the thing to remember is that the main strategic difference is that if the rook is going to c7, black is not going to be playing the plan of c takes b4, well, not c takes b4, yeah, c takes b4, b5, and then meeting c5 with e5. He's not going to meet it with e5 because c takes d6 is always going to be hitting this rook on c7. Instead, black is going to really need to go into the heart of the double Mujannah and the fiercest parts, and exchange, try to make something of these passed pawns. Really try to attack the c5 pawn and really play aggressively. And then here, I think you just want to know with black that the key move is going to be knight to c6. Just to show you one more time this draw so that you remember it. It's exchanging, playing a5. White plays first hand to d2, just continuing with this plan, and now rook to a8, leaving white with nothing better than to take the threefold repetition. Okay. All right, so that is the rook to c7 Mujannah. I am going to just check how I'm doing on time here. Okay. I have one more set of lines that I want to cover in this lecture, and then in my last lecture on the double Mujannah, I'll just try to wrap up some odds and ends, looking at alternative strategies for both sides. So the other line that I wanted to try to get to today, this will be much simpler, although the analysis does go a little bit deep in Al-Lajlaj. So just looking at this position, all right, where we were at move 14, we're at move 14, has been pawn to a3. Okay, all right. So instead of rook to g2, white can play pawn to a3 here. And pawn to a3 is definitely another try besides rook to g2, and we just want to remember after pawn to h6, white probably doesn't want to play b4 because black will play g5, and then the rook can't really go to g2 because after g takes f4, white would be forced to play e takes f4 because the rook on g2 is defended. So just the thing to note would be after pawn to h6, white would want to, instead of breaking with b4, want to play rook to g2 right away, so as to meet g5 with rook on g to c2 or rook to b2, so that we can set up this structure with the first hand sitting on g3 and denying black all counterplay on the first hand side. So pawn to a3 is another try. Pawn to h6 wasn't favored by Al-Lajlaj for that the reason that I just mentioned. Black will play pawn to a6 instead. White now will continue with 15b4 takes, and black will play pawn to b5. So this is a crossroads for white, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this position because this really gets to kind of the heart of what I would call, Al-Lajlaj's play in the the 800s and 900s versus how we might play this today. I think there would be a very strong temptation to play c takes b5 today, with the idea of hopefully just getting a slight pull. And I wanted to look at this specific line because Al-Lajlaj actually does give some lines here for both sides. Whereas in my first lecture, where we looked at the lines with black putting the rook on b7, there hadn't really been any analysis on this alternative. So after the exchange, and Al-Lajlaj also analyzes the move c5 in some depth. So after the exchange, cb5, ab5, white plays pawn to e4, and the idea here being clearing the route for the first hand to get up to the e3 square. Couple moves here. Black might just continue to copy with pawn to e5. I will show you a very lengthy line that Al-Lajlaj gives, and I think it's meant largely as an illustration line. So let's say that Black, rather than trying to copy, tries to bring his rook over. White will just meet Black, keeping the status quo on this side. Black now plays pawn to e5. Again, maybe what else? This first hand is going to be passive otherwise. Now Al-Lajlaj suggests the exchange, and then bringing the knight into d5. Logical attack. Knight takes d5, e takes d5. If you note, there's going to be a problem here for Black because this pawn is hanging on e5. So knight jumps back. White is going to grab the pawn on e5. You'll note that there's a problem. So if Black were to play knight takes d5, there is this nasty fork. So Black throws in the exchange of rooks. Knight takes d5 is still problematic due to the fork, so Black just gets his rook out of the way. And now we really see kind of the heart of Al-Lajlaj's and Asuli's theory of the two Furzans. White now has a better Furzan, so he's going to have a slight pull in the endgame. Plays his Furzan in to d2 for move 25 here. Black takes on d5. White wants to relocate his knight to a square that puts a little more pressure on the b5 pawn, so drops the knight into c6 with check. Black plays king to c7, and the knight goes to d4. So the position is absolutely symmetrical, except that White has this good center pawn and Black has this pawn hanging out on f5, which is really more of just an eventual target. So Al-Lajlaj continues the analysis. Bishop to d6, Furzan to c3. Black is going to try to develop his Furzan. White plays king to b3, trying to just shore up his entire position here. Furzan comes into c6. White plays bishop to a3. You notice that this elephant, it's a theory of two Furzans, but here it's also a theory of two elephants. The elephant on a3 is going into the c5 square. That's a lot better than its counterpart. So rook to a7. White now swings over, takes control of the e-file. This makes one think that this was probably an actual game that happened in practice, because otherwise it doesn't really make that much sense for Al-Lajlaj to have continued the analysis out to this point. Particularly since here Al-Lajlaj gives a very strange move for Black, which is bishop takes b4. And after knight takes, king takes, he just concludes that, okay, White has a dominating advantage. This b5 pawn is weak. His first hand's coming into a good square potentially. B5 pawn will eventually fall when White gets an elephant on it. This elephant is coming into c5. So, and the rook positions, the White rook is so much better. Why Furzan takes on b4? I think likely this was just a game and Black cracked under pressure. There's not really any reason to do it. Black probably just has to sit around, mope, bide his time, maybe try to bring this rook back into the game somehow because it's been sidelined. Maybe, I don't know, maybe king to b6, followed by trying to exchange rooks. seems like there are much more tenacious ways for black to try to hold. But okay, Al-Lajlaj gives bishop takes b4, and yeah, after this exchange, white would be very, very disappointed not to win that endgame. But I really like this line. Again, my best guess is that this is a sample game, or that this is an actual game that would have occurred around the time Al-Lajlaj was writing. And I really, really like this because it shows the theory of the two fursands so well. The fact that white has an extra move allows him to exchange, win this pawn, and then in the endgame, his knight is, or his fursan, excuse me, is going to be so much better than black's fursan. So, or and just either way you do it, white's going to have that subtle but very powerful positional advantage, and it really shows you what the ancients played for sometimes in the double Mujannah. So that's why black doesn't play pawn to e5, is that it just allows the exchange of knight to d5, as in that sample game. So what does black play instead? Well, okay. So instead of throwing in the rook lifts, pawn to e5 immediately is a suggestion. It's a potential way for black to play. Now, of course, this isn't so much of a threat because we're not hitting this rook on c7 anymore, so it's really not so big of a deal. So white would just continue with development. Maybe it's possible to do this rook swing, but if black isn't doing it, white has no need. So better to just consolidate in the center. We see both sides coming up. It's possible here that both sides are going to play their fursands in, and then maybe white's going to play bishop to h3. This is my idea, just trying to create a little bit of a pull on this side of the board. White is going to exchange, maybe bring a knight to h4, try to hit the f5 pawn, and my analysis runs takes, takes. White has some knight to g5 ideas, so black might play h6, just trying to hold this side. Looks like this is going to be playable for black. So Al-Lajlaj suggests, rather than bringing the fursan into e3, Al-Lajlaj suggests for white that white go ahead and initiate some exchanges. So the line he gives is taking on e5, playing here, and then playing the bishop out to h3 to attack this pawn. But ultimately, Al-Lajlaj concludes that black is going to have the resources here to hold a draw. I actually think black might be able to get away with playing the fursan into e6 here, and my analysis on this just runs, okay, white brings a fursan to e3, black plays bishop d6. White really doesn't seem to be getting anywhere with this because, okay, well, if knight to h4, the pawn's going to come up. So, white maybe doesn't have anything better than this pawn break. Black plays something like this, bringing the pawn to e4. White tries to play for something on the dark squares. Black can just avoid exchanging, wouldn't want to take and run into this fork. And it seems like black is holding here. There's good control over the f4 square. There's good control over the b4 square thanks to this active piece. The f5 pawn is overprotected, and black has some counterplay on d5. At some point, this Ferdinand might run in. So it seems to me like Al-Lajlaj's idea of trying to bust open the center for white might be premature. But Al-Lajlaj senses a different way for black to play, and just basically goes straight for equality with pawn to e4. And then after the exchange, d takes e4, f takes e4, Al-Lajlaj gives knight to d2. And then rook to g4. You notice white's position is kind of disintegrating here. White needs to come up with a way to keep attacking this pawn. Al-Lajlaj suggests bishop to f1. I guess the idea is to kick out this rook. Okay, Al-Lajlaj now gives just jettison the pawn to e3. White takes it, and then rook takes b4, and Al-Lajlaj gets this position as being equal. Yeah, and I don't disagree. White has nothing here. All the pieces are going to come off the board. All the pawns are going to come off the board. Maybe white can, maybe either side can make some complications, but there's no advantage for white. So okay, so to make a long story short, this position after the exchange, if white plays pawn to e4, which I think is the best move, this rook lift is ill-advised because when black eventually does play pawn to e5, white's going to have an advantage with knight to d5 hitting the rook. So black can just play this immediately. And then, when we get to this position, I think the right way for white to proceed is probably just to go ahead and try to make something of this. Al-Lajlaj plays more concretely, and brings a lot of stuff off the board, but black certainly has a way to get an easy draw, or black maybe can even play for an advantage, which is my idea. So this is all why Al-Lajlaj, after the move b5, doesn't really see anything for c takes b5, and suggests instead that white play pawn to c5. And I do really like the move pawn to c5 here. I would probably play it myself. And I think this shows really some of the things that we can learn from the ancients. Because I think today we would just be obsessed with trying to get a small edge here. So pawn to c5. I like this for white better than when the black rook is on c7. It seems to me that this is going to lead to a good game. We don't need to look at d5. We know thematically that's bad. D takes, B takes. This probably isn't the right time for black to try to play it, because without having a rook somewhere active here, there's really no good way to get pressure on the c5 pawn. Seems like white gets his dream position pretty easily. So, black's play just isn't aggressive enough to probably get the move d takes c5 in. So what other options does black have? Well, the thematic option, e5. That's the one to try here. And, as we know, usually white will play takes, and black will then want to throw in this exchange, and black will play takes. But here it doesn't work out. I mean, white's really just tied down to the b4 pawn. But Al-Lajlaj has a very different idea for white here. Very interesting thematic idea that we have not really seen yet, which is this exchange and creating a passed pawn for white on c5. So exchange, exchange, and now Al-Lajlaj suggests pawn to d4, which I think is a really, really interesting idea. Pawn to d5 is obviously going to be brutal. So black has to really do something to mix it up. The problem for black is that he just hasn't developed enough pieces. If this exchange happens, it looks like white really is getting this pawn break in. Um, maybe black is going to take some time to try to prepare it or to try to fend it off. And we'll try to get the d5 square. But ultimately, it seems like white's done a good thing for his first hand. His first hand's going to come into e5 in the middle game. I like white's chances. So therefore, Al-Lajlaj suggests a very radical try, pawn to a5. The line that Al-Lajlaj gives here, so black is basically just trying to mix it up any way he can to try to prevent a strategic squeeze out. Al-Lajlaj suggests pawn takes b4, black would play b4, trying to keep an initiative, and then knight to a4. And Al-Lajlaj seems to think that this is unclear. I think the idea is black is going to try to sink a knight on d5 and have good counterplay with tactics on c3 with a knight potentially coming into c3. Seems like black is getting some counterplay. But I don't think there's any need for white to play b takes a5. I really like the move knight takes e5 here. This is just my own suggestion. This is a huge threat, obviously, so black is going to exchange. White will play d takes e5. We're now threatening this knight. Knight to g4 because black needs to keep attacking things. And here, white isn't going to be able to defend the pawn on e5, but the pawn on b5 is a juicy target. So bishop to d3 looks good. Black is going to take on e5. Now grab the pawn on b5. I like white's position here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. We have 5 pawns against 4. Black's initiative, if he has any, isn't going to come to anything. So rook to g7 is sort of a potential idea. White can even just play pawn to e4 here with the idea that the bishop maybe will defend a c5 pawn at some point. And white is going to try to simplify into an endgame where he's slightly better. So just sort of following the line that I would give here, black might achieve this check, but doesn't really do anything. White's going to end up a pawn. Maybe still a drawn endgame, but I think white gets an extra pawn, and we'll have some good chances. So just to wrap that up, Al-Lajlaj, he focuses on the lines where both sides are going to put a rook on a key square on the Shah side and are going to play this maneuver. He doesn't like the immediate b4 as much because he thinks that after c5, e5, to him this seems unclear, and he also thinks, probably rightly, that this leads to nothing for white. But my thought is actually here. I like Al-Lajlaj's suggestion of d4, and then after pawn to a5, I would just go ahead and play knight takes e5, and I think that this position surrounding the pawn on b5 is promising for white. Okay, so that's a lot of material. I'm going to leave the lecture here. you know, main takeaways. This move pawn to c5, very interesting idea by Al-Lajlaj, very deep, and you know, hopefully for white playing a good Fursian endgame. Thank you all so much.